following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Railway lines on Vancouver Island have sat mostly unused for years, but the way those lines were built continues to impact society. Back in the 1880s, around 2 million acres of land on southern Vancouver Island were privatized when they were granted to the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway Company in exchange for building the railway. Today on the program, we'll try and scratch the surface of how that grant continues to echo today.
I'm Dr. Kelly Black. I am an adjunct professor at Vancouver Island University in the Department of History, and I'm also the president of the Vancouver Island Local History Society. So I am a public historian with an interest in talking to people about the legacy of the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway Land Grant. And
that's what we're going to do today. Thank you very much for being willing to do that. So close to 2 million acres of land and $750,000 were given over to build the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway. What's the context people need to know about how and why this land grant came about?
In the context of the ENN land grant, one of the most important things to note is that governments wanted to use land as a form of capital for companies. In other words, they wanted to use it as an inducement to build the railway. In Canada, in British Columbia, there weren't a lot of capitalists, a lot of industrialists with a lot of money. There were some, but not like in the United States. And so in order to persuade capitalists, industrialists to build a railway, the Canadian government used land. The federal and provincial government said, if you build this railway, we will give you a little bit of money, but we will also give you all this land that you'll then be able to create profit from. And therefore, we hope you will build the railway. And so the land grant is essentially a part of a carrot and stick scenario where the provincial and federal governments wanted investors to get together and say, we'll be the ones to do it for this. So that's the context. The context is the need to create a group of people that will spend the money in order to acquire the land and whatever else came with it in order to profit. And hopefully, governments thought, the benefits will, trickle down, as it were, to the province, to the nation.
So close to 2 million acres of land. That sounds like a lot, but what exactly is the land we're talking about? Can you paint me a picture?
Well, it's about 1/3 of Vancouver Island, going from essentially north of Victoria, sort of the Malahat area, all the way to Campbell River, and encompassing about, as you said, 2 million acres, but not only, the land, but mineral rights, timber rights, foreshore rights. So, into the water. And you can kind of draw a line. If you look at a map of Vancouver Island, you can kind of draw a line almost right down the center of the island from the Goldstream area near Victoria, Langford, all the way up to Campbell River, from the east coast of the island to the center and straight up. The ENN land grant on a map on the west side of it is a perfectly straight line. It doesn't zigzag back and forth or anything like that. That's essentially what they did, is they just drew a line on the map and said, here you go. Now, as I'm sure we'll get into, there's some nuance there when it came right down to it, but on a map, it's fairly straightforward.
Okay, what is the nuance you alluded to there? So you mentioned that it's kind of starting around the Malahat region all the way up to Campbell River. Now, even at the time, there were kind of settlers already living in that region. Nanaimo already existed. What are the considerations with land that was there and was owned by people? I know we'll get into maybe some of the First Nations considerations later, but even just on the settler side of things.
Yes, well, of course, this is all First Nations territory that is not encompassed in any treaty, with small exception of Douglas Treaty or Vancouver Island Treaty signed in Nanaimo in 1854. But no First Nations in the land grant area consented to this grant of land. But on top of that, if you look at it on a map, it kind of appears to be a perfect block. If you look at the historical map of the grant. But of course, as you said, there are settlers living there, and there are towns that exist, including Nanaimo and, in the Cowichan Valley and other places. And so, if you were to drill down to it, you would see that it's not a perfect block, that there are bits and pieces that are already what we might call preempted, or have already become private land granted by the Crown to settlers. And so a lot of this land that's already been granted by the Crown to settlers or sold to settlers is in and around communities we know today. Nanaimo, Parksville, the Comox Valley, the Cowichan Valley, Cobble Hill, Millpay, these kinds of places. So once you account for that, it's still a significant area of land. Of course, through the history of the land grant after it happened in the 1880s, there are people who come forward and say, hey, I was here on this land before the land grant, therefore, doesn't belong to the ENN Railway Company, it belongs to me. And there are several court cases that settlers bring forward throughout the late 1890s and the early 1900s, which then leads to other grants that happen where the provincial and federal governments either agree or disagree with these settlers. And in the cases where they agree, they say, okay, well, because we're going to give this settler their plot of land back, or their rights to the land back, we're going to give the railway company more land to make up for the land we're now taking away. So the ENN land grant actually is like 4 grants that happen. The big one happens in 1884 or 1887, depending on what date you choose for when the grant was transferred between the provincial and federal governments. And then again in the 1910s and the early 1920s, more land is transferred. So when we talk about the land grant, we're actually talking about multiple grants over a number of years.
You talked about it there off the top of that answer, but what is the impact of this land grant today on treaty negotiations with First Nations?
Well, in the modern BC treaty process that was sort of implemented in the early 1990s, First Nations in British Columbia that choose to participate in the BC Treaty Commission process are not permitted to negotiate for private property. Now, in large swaths of the province of British Columbia, which is, of course, an enormous place, this isn't as much of an issue because most land is, as far as the provincial government is concerned, Crown land. So the province retains the rights and title to that land, again, as far as the province is concerned. However, on Vancouver Island, with the ENN land grant, that privatized this, basically 1/3, 2 million acres of land, which means that the Crown doesn't hold that right in the land. It's now owned by private property owners, which means that those First Nations on Vancouver Island that are participating in this treaty process and their territories are encompassed by the grant, it means that they can't negotiate for it. So the Hul'qumi'num Treaty Group, which is part of several First Nations that are in and around the Cowichan Valley, 84% of their territory was taken up by the grant. So they are, as far as the provincial government is concerned, not able to negotiate for 84% of their traditional territory. So, as I said earlier, the Hul'quami'num peoples, the First Nations within the grant, never consented to this grant. They never signed a treaty for this land. And so we have this real conundrum of a modern treaty process that says we accept this grant for what it is, and therefore you're not eligible to have that territory returned to you unless essentially you buy it yourself, or we give you money to maybe buy it. But we're talking about an enormous amount of territory. So the implications of it are very real. They are very present, and they are ongoing.
What happened to this land after, 800,000-ish hectares, 2 million acres-ish were given to a company? Now more than 100 years, well over 100 years have passed. What happened to the land over the course of that?
Well, at first, not much. The ENN Railway Company's, head lead investor was Robert Dunsmuir, who many people in Nanaimo will know. It was, a coal baron, and made his money and his family's money in coal. And he was joined in forming the ENN Railway Company and winning the contract to build the railway. He was joined by several American investors. So Dunsmuir's interests are coal, primarily. And of course, the railway helps him get his coal to market. So good news for his, other business interests. But the Dunsmuirs and at first, the ENN Railway Company, they're mostly only interested in coal. A lot of the ENN land grant area is not coal land, it's forest land. It's big, big trees. And in the 1880s, it's rather difficult to get big, big trees out from the interior of Vancouver Island. Most of the logging that's happening is happening near rivers and lakes, near water courses, with animal teams, and then a little later, steam power. But the steam power is slow to come on the scene. So for the first couple of decades, there's not much happening except for, kind of your coal extraction and your travel of passengers. Because the Dunsmuirs are mostly interested in coal, they kind of sell off portions to people who are interested in logs, in timber and lumber. And the big sale happens in 1905 when the ENN Railway Company sells the railway and most of the land grant lands, with a few notable exceptions, to the Canadian Pacific Railway Company. And that's when the extraction of logs begins to ramp up. And if we fast forward through the 20th century, for the purposes of radio, today, what remains of the large chunks of the ENN land grant lands are owned by private forestry companies, mostly by Mosaic Forestry. Any listener who's ever been out to the Nanaimo Lakes and had to go through a big orange gate, that big orange gate, is opened and closed by Mosaic Forestry Management. And the reason that they have that big orange gate there is because those are ENN lands that they came to acquire many, many years ago as the Canadian Pacific Railway sold it off to large forestry corporations, and they are kind of the successor to this legacy today.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
Today on the program, we're exploring the legacy of the E&N land grant. In the 1880s, government granted around 2 million acres of land to the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway Company in exchange for building a railway on Vancouver Island. This had the effect of privatizing most of the land between Campbell River and Victoria on the eastern half of Vancouver Island. I'm speaking with Kelly Black, president of the Vancouver Island Local History Society and an adjunct professor at VIU. If the idea of giving the land away in the first place was that we would get this railway out of it that we really wanted, did we get value on the dollar? Was this thought of at the time as a good deal, and did it work out for us?
Well, it depends what you mean by we. If you're a First Nation within the land grant, no, absolutely not. Of course not. If you mean forestry companies, absolutely. They got and continue to have, I think, a screaming deal. For your settlers who are kind of farming or doing other things, there was a time when passenger service was important, but especially in the kind of pre-Second World War era. Mostly the rail line, though, serves the purpose of transporting goods to market. And because it's Vancouver Island, that mostly means logs and minerals, coal in particular. There is, some farmers early on when the railway is built are excited that they can, ship their dairy or their produce to large markets, like farmers in Cowichan can ship much faster, their dairy products to Victoria or Nanaimo. So, that's really great for them. But the rise of the automobile, of course, the private automobile starts to put a dent in this. And then, of course, the rise of truck logging means that freight on the E&N Railway really begins to decline as well through the post-Second World War era. And even by the 1960s, people are saying, well, maybe the transportation on the rail line will go away. Oh, well, we've all got cars now. No big deal. So to your question of, did we, and I'm putting air quotes around that for people listening, get value for money? I would say maybe not. But some people got a lot of value and a lot of money.
Can you tell me about maybe the political context of the time? So Robert Dunsmuir, who built this railway, was also a politician at the provincial level. What was maybe some of the difference? Is there something where we should think, oh, that was really shady and you wouldn't be able to get away with that today? Is there a kind of conspiracy element to this?
I don't know if it's a conspiracy. I think it's just that the politicians and some, people who elected the politicians, in this case, in this time period, that's property owning men, believed that this is just how you got things done. As I said off the top, the context is we need somebody who has a lot of money to build this railway because you have to have capital. And the Dunsmuir family was the capitalist family of the time. They weren't, they didn't get their money from England. They Robert Dunsmuir, began working for the Hudson's Bay Company in the early colonial period and found a big coal seam, and off he went making his money. And so I think for politicians, especially at the time, it was natural that they would turn to this person that had all this money and, as far as they were concerned, experience building big ventures. Now, that doesn't mean that at the time when this happened, everybody agreed with it. There's plenty of, newspaper articles and letters written to, the Daily Colonist, for example, in Victoria, that say, hey, this isn't good. Monopoly, because, the ENN Railway Company had a monopoly on the railway line. Monopoly isn't good. This isn't how we should do things. So, it's not a grand consensus that this is how it should be done, but certainly that is how it was done. And I think, when you look at the Canadian Pacific Railway built across Canada, there's a land grant associated with that too. And that was just sort of standard operating procedure for the time, is that if you want a railway built in Canada, you have to have this inducement of land associated with it so that it's a good deal for the people who are going to pull together the investors to make it happen. I think in some ways, people listening would probably say, well, not much has changed. We look at things like public-private partnerships that, have come about in the last 20, 30 years to build things in Canada, or we look at the various bits of infrastructure in Canada, like cell phones, right? Or your internet. How many companies are there in Canada? 4, right? There's something about the political effort to build the nation state of Canada involves giving money and land to a handful of capitalists.
So what can we learn about that? Like, what should people think about this grant? We can understand this grant. What are the questions we should maybe ask about it to inform how we look at both its impacts today and just other things that go on in our world today that you were just mentioning?
Well, one of the most interesting things that's happening right now and has been happening for the last about 20 years is that forestry companies, Island Timberlands, Timber West, now Mosaic, began in the early 2000s seeing their forestry lands as not only a place to grow and cut down and grow again trees, but also as a potential for real estate. So they created a spin-off real estate company called Couverton, and their whole job is to increase their value for shareholders by selling off parcels of what they deem to be desirable high-value land. So around Nanaimo, this includes, around the Nanaimo River, for example. Even in Campbell River, Couverton is creating whole neighborhoods out of their land holdings that are tied to the ENN land grant. So we are seeing a couple of things happen. We're seeing the land spun off even further from possible restitution to First Nations, which I believe is something that should happen. So it's getting further removed. Not only is it, tied to a forestry company, well, now it's going to become someone's house. So that's even farther away from being returned to First Nations whose land it is. The other question is one of sort of climate change, transportation, and urban sprawl. We are seeing this sale of what are former forestry lands for the purposes of real estate development. What does that mean for the growth of Vancouver Island communities? If the rail line, which is just the line itself, the corridor, is owned by the Island Corridor Foundation, they don't have much to do with the land grant. They just own the corridor. But if they are successful in returning rail service, passenger service to Vancouver Island, what will it mean for the growth of communities around the rail line that may grow on these granted lands. So there's all kinds of questions that come up, but one of the most important is, what's the future of Vancouver Island? What's the future of the process of reconciliation and restitution of lands with and to First Nations people on Vancouver Island? So the land grant is, or at least on most of Vancouver Island, the land grant is, right at the heart of all of that. And we need to be aware of it. We need to talk about it. And we need the people in power to do something about it.
We're aware of it. We're talking about it right now. What are the kinds of things you think the people in power should be able to do about it? I imagine if you were to have a conversation like this, at some point someone might say, well, we live in a country of laws, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. One of the laws is that Canada and British Columbia needs to sign treaties with First Nations peoples. It's like one of the original laws, 1763, the Royal Proclamation said exactly that. And British Columbia has been, derelict in its duty to do so, which is why we have the modern treaty process. However, it says, British Columbia government has said First Nations cannot negotiate for private land. That's a rule that the British Columbia government made up. They could change it if they wanted to. Or, one of the things that we see regularly in British Columbia is, in the creation of parks on Vancouver Island, the federal and provincial government have given money to forestry corporations to acquire land. Now, I'm not saying this is the best approach, because they were essentially gifted the land in the first place, but the provincial government, in a piecemeal kind of way in the last few years, has purchased land for restitution to First Nations. Now, they should probably do that if they believe in the supremacy of property rights, which they seem to, private property rights. Then, by their logic, they can and should purchase grant lands for the restitution to First Nations peoples. Those are some ideas. And, the Hulkaminum Treaty Group in 2007 published a public document called The Great Land Grab. And they talk about exactly this, about the ways that it has impacted their lives and their well-being and their sacred places. And they have, proposed the solutions and ideas. And so, the time to listen to them is long gone, and it's still here. So let's do it now.
How much do you think the legacy of the land grant is intertwined with the future, or lack thereof potentially, of the railway? Like, I can understand on some level the idea that, man, the government gave away a third of, or a fifth of the area of the island to build a railway that doesn't even exist anymore. That seems really frustrating. But if the railway were to suddenly come back, does that make it any less frustrating?
No, but I think that there's a question of what happens today on the land grant lands. And that's why this question of, forestry companies using it for the purposes of forestry, but also using it for the purposes of real estate. In summation, there are shareholders, investors right now, right this very minute, that are continuing to profit off the E&N land grant. And if and when the rail line returns, anyone with an interest in speculation and property is probably going to further profit by virtue of communities situated in and around a rail line. That's how it was in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that's how it will be today if a rail line returns. So the question we should ask ourselves is, does it matter that some people continue to profit from the dispossession that was the land grant? I think it does matter.
Kelly Black, for time purposes and time purposes only, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for talking about this.
Kelly Black is an adjunct professor in the Department of History at VIU and president of the Vancouver Island Local History Society. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Sailor Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.